And speaking of people that we love to have here, Mr. Mark Carlson, the speaker that I mentioned before. Mark and I were from San Diego. I can't thank him for taking the time out and agreeing to come all the way out to Palm Springs, although I don't think it's too tough. So it's pretty decent here, too. Mark is a freelance writer and an aviation historian. He spent a lot of time as a docent and a researcher for San Diego Air and Space Museum, kind of a friendly museum with us down in San Diego way. Mark is legally blind, and you'll notice that he is here with his friend Saffron. Saffron came along with us as well. He's past president of Poway Black Mountain Toastmasters with ACS and CL Awards. He established the Fun Speakable historical lecture series for local organizations, adult communities, and schools. He's also here today with several books on a whole variety of topics. I'm going to let him share that with you, but there'll be an opportunity for a book signing at the end here. Mark is a very well-read, very well-researched historical speaker, and we're honored and privileged to have him here. Mark Carlson, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me clearly? Good. Yeah, as Greg said, I am legally blind, so I work with a computer that speaks to me, and I'll be using my headset so that I can hear what the screen is telling me, but I can't see it, so hopefully the pictures are what they're supposed to be. I'm going to be talking today about the mystery of Hornet Air Wing 8 at Midway. Now, we all know about the Battle of Midway. We know most of the pertinent facts. If you read Gordon Prander's book, Walter Lord's book, Samuel Eliot Morrison, you read about the buildup to protect Midway, which was the Japanese target for June 1942. And we know about how desperate it was to assemble 3 carriers and as many planes as possible to get out there and stop the Japanese from neutralizing and occupying Midway. And we know about how the U.S. Fleet 2 Task Force assembled 151 planes from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown to attack the Japanese fleet as fast as possible. And we know about the 3 torpedo squadrons, Torpedo 8, Torpedo 6, and Torpedo 3, which lost 69 airmen, all to stop the Japanese. And then we know about the Dauntless dive bombers that showed up in a 5-minute period from the Yorktown and Enterprise and savaged 3 Japanese carriers in a 5-minute period. We know about all that. That's pretty well established history. But if you read through those books, you'll notice that there's something missing. What happened to Air Wing 8? We know that Torpedo 8 was the first one to reach the Japanese fleet and that they were all shot down and only 1 man survived. And we know that the Yorktown and Enterprise planes took on the Japanese fleet. What happened to Air Wing 8's dive bombers? You read all 3 of those books, and there's a big missing piece. We know about some of the planes that reached Midway that had to ditch in the lagoon or were actually shot down by trigger-happy air gunners. Some of them were from Air Wing 8. They all took off from the 2 task force at about the same time. They all flew in the same direction. They were following the same course to the same destination. Where did the 34 dive bombers and 10 fighters that were supposed to be part of Air Wing 8 turn up? Where did they go? Not one of them arrived in time to be part of the battle. Not one of them found the Japanese fleet. So this is a mystery that has only recently come to light. And so let's go over it. We have to cover some of the broad strokes about the Battle of Midway itself. Now we know that Midway wasn't much of a target. Only about 4 square miles. It's just these tiny little islets surrounded by a lagoon, 1,200 miles northwest of Hawaii. But it was a very strategic target. It was one of the bases for the China Clippers between the United States and China. But its very location made it of strategic importance. And when When ThinkPAC's cryptanalyst, Joseph Rochefort of Station H and Edwin Layton all told Nimitz, we know where the Japanese fleet is coming, we know where they're going to get there, we know when they're going to attack, what direction they're going to attack from, and what time. They were only off by 5 degrees, 5 minutes, and 5 miles. It was an incredible piece of cryptanalysis. And Layton and Nimitz decided to try to put together as much strength as possible. They managed to get a hold of the Enterprise and the Hornet, the new Hornet, which had only seen one action, and that was the Doolittle raid, and the Enterprise, and the badly crippled Yorktown, which had come back from Coral Sea, leaking oil, and it needed 3 months for repair, but Nimitz said, you've got 3 days. And they got it back into fighting shrimp. So Task Force 16 and Task Force 17 were going to be there at Midway with everything they had. And Nimitz did the same thing by putting as many aircraft together as possible to support Midway, to help it defend the island and to attack the Japanese. He got everything he could. He got the Army cooperation, he got the Marine cooperation, and the Navy cooperation. He put together B-17s and TBF Avengers, and even B-26 Marauders, PBY. Anything that could carry a bomb or a torpedo was sent to Midway. He was giving them all the support they could. The Japanese plan had been in place for several months, and it had been worked over and changed by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. And it was going to be under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo of the 1st Carrier Striking Force. It was the same one who commanded the Kido Butai attack at Pearl Harbor. He was only going to have 4 carriers this time because Shokaku and Zuikaku had been savaged so badly at Pearl Sea. But 4 carriers should be more than enough because the American fleet wouldn't be around. By the time the American fleet, the sound of freedom, the American fleet would show up to try to save Midway because, of course, the Americans didn't know anything about it, about the attack. So the Japanese plan was pretty audacious. It was very well planned out to the minute. Every striking force, the occupation force, the Atu force, the submarine cordon, everything was laid out. But it was all based on one thing, that the Americans didn't know what was coming, that they would be in complete surprise. The Japanese would never have believed that the Americans not only knew about it, but were ready for it. The 2 carrier divisions of the 1st Carrier Striking Force were under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo and Tamon Yamaguchi. First Carrier Division and the 2nd Carrier Division, the Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. And they were going to be providing the aircraft that would send the first wave to attack Midway and try to neutralize its defenses so that another wave, if necessary, and then the occupation force could invade the island itself. Again, the Japanese were very inflexible. They couldn't really manage anything when the plan didn't go as they had expected. But these 2 men were going to make the decision that would affect the course of the war for Japan. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu. Altogether, they could launch about 300 planes. And 2 waves of aircraft were going to be attacking Midway. The first one would take off and head for Midway, bomb it, and then he would have the second wave ready to attack it. But he also wanted to have planes that were prepared to take on any unexpected American ship. When the American ship came up, the second wave would be ready. So the men that were on the spot were Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, in command of Task Force 17, and Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, Task Force 16. Spruance had been chosen by Halsey. Halsey had gotten contact dermatitis, and he was going to have to sit this one out. And it must not have been an easy choice for him. But he put Spruance in charge Both of these men were black shoe admirals. They were not aviators. And so they would not be thinking in aviator terms, but they were smart enough to listen to the aviators. They were smart enough to do what's necessary. You have aircraft carriers, you've got planes, you're going to use them. These were really long odds. 28 ships in the American fleet of carriers, cruisers, and destroyers, against 88 ships of the Japanese fleet. They were somewhat evenly matched if you added up all the aircraft, all the Japanese aircraft on the carriers, and the American carrier aircraft, as well as the land-based aircraft. They were almost evenly matched. But the Japanese had the advantage of experience. They had already done Pearl Harbor, they had done Coral Sea, they had fought a lot of action. They were motivated, they were trained. The American ones were, for the most part, not combat veterans. They'd seen very little combat, and they were fighting a desperate action. They were desperate to try to stop the Japanese. So it was going to be fight with what you've got, do your best. So the first wave from the Japanese would be 108 aircraft of level bombers armed with bombs, and these were the Capes, and dive bombers and fighters. And they were going to be taken off from the ships, while the second wave would be held in reserve, fly down to Midway. Well, this is where that solid gold intelligence came in, because the Americans were ready. They put up everything they had. They had Wildcats and Brewster bus floats, and they went up and they attacked and started chopping up the attack force. They didn't stop it. All they could do was take off pieces of it, and they suffered terrible losses. But it was the first indication to Nagumo that the Americans were more ready than he expected them to be. So as soon as they knew the location of the Japanese fleet, the Americans decided to go and attack. They had gotten the word from the PBYs, and they knew the location about 200 miles northwest of Midway. And they sent off B-17s and B-24, B-26s armed with torpedoes. That must have been an interesting thing for the Army pilot. And Marine dive bombers, both Dauntlesses and Vindicators, and 6 brand new TBF Avengers. Now, we all know about Torpedo 8, the 15 planes that took off from Hornet and were shot down with only 1 survivor. But that was the lead element of Torpedo 8. The rear echelon was back at Ford Island, and they were getting familiarized with the brand new TBF Avengers that they were the first squadron to get these planes. And they were still learning how to use them. And the executive officer, Larson, had been working with these planes, and they felt that they had 6 pilots that were experienced enough, not in combat, but at least in flying them, to join the Midway force. So Nimitz sent 6 of those up. Now, when they were arriving at Midway after a 1,200-mile flight with Bombay, there was some concern about whether or not they might get shot down, because by this time everybody in Midway was pretty trigger happy. And one of the gunners said, well, how do we know what a TBF looks like? And they said, well, it looks like a pregnant F4F. So they said, okay, and then when they saw it, not a finger touched the trigger, so it worked. But these 6 TBF were going to be the first time they went into action, and it was part of Torpedo 8. And I'll be telling you a bit more about that if we go on. But this strike force, at 7:05, the first planes reached the Japanese fleet heading southeast towards Midway. And this was not a coordinated attack. It was everybody just get in there and try and get a hit. The B-26s went in, and they were torn apart. As good as the B-26 was, it really was not suited for torpedo bombing. But whatever you could do, they worked at it. They usually drop too far out, or they drop at the wrong speed or the wrong angle. Then the TBFs went in, and the 6 of them all moved in one at a time and dropped their fish. 5 of them were shot down before they got close to the Japanese fleet. Only 1 survived, and that was under the command of Ensign Bert Ernest with his gunner Harry Ferrier. The second attack of the B-17s and the Marine dive bombers, the Dauntlesses and the Vindicators came in. Every one of these attacks was by itself. There was no coordination. There was nothing like a combined attack from different directions to try to overwhelm the gunners and to sandwich the ship within. It was everyone for themselves. The B-17, if you listen to any of the reports from the B-17 bomber crewmen, they sank pretty much half the Japanese force. In reality, they didn't hit a single thing. Trying to drop a bomb from 20,000 feet on a madly twisting and speeding ship. Have you ever tried to drop a marble on a running mouse? That's what it was like. Not one of them hit. But they were still doing their part. The Marine dive bombers went in. First the Dauntlesses, which did it at a fairly shallow angle, and then the Vindicators came in. And these were like glide bombers. They came in low and slow, and they were sitting ducks for the fighters. What they did do, even if they didn't hit a single ship, was they forced Nagumo's ship to twist and turn and maneuver to avoid it. And it broke up the formation, and it broke up their timetable. It slowed Nagumo down. This is Ensign Bert Ernest TBF. It was shot to ribbons. He barely made it back. There was more air than plane. He had no hydraulics, he had no brakes, he had only his trim tab, the only thing that worked. But he managed to make it back. This plane was so shot to pieces that it was obviously out of combat, but some of the Grumman engineers came out to take a look at it and admire, their work and learn from it. This, by the way, is the other lone survivor of Torpedo 8. So after having bombed Midway, the first Midway strike force of 108 planes returned to the carriers and starts landing. And Nagumo had sent out some scout planes to reconnoiter to the east to see if there was any American presence. For the longest time, there was no report of any ships at all. But then his number 4 search plane from the cruiser Tone, which had been late, finally reported in that they spotted an American carrier about 200 miles to the east. That had to be a big surprise, a shock for Nagumo, because he was sure the American carriers were still at Pearl Harbor and that they would be leaving at that point, that they would encounter the submarine, and they would be shot to pieces and sunk as soon as they reached Midway, because he would be ready for them. But now he's got a decision to make. Should he... Okay. The 3 carriers were already up there at Point Luck, Task Force 16 and Task Force 17. They had a rough idea where the Japanese fleet was, but what they were trying to do was to move to the southwest and to get as close as possible so they could launch the first strike against the Japanese carrier. They didn't want to be too close, because they didn't want to be within Japanese range, but they wanted to be able to do it at just the limit of the American striking force range. So, all that morning, even before dawn, the carriers had been bringing the planes up. The Dauntless, I have models of them here, the Dauntless dive bombers, the TBF, TBD Devastators, torpedo bombers, and the Wildcat fighters. They were going to send everything they had, 151 planes, at the Japanese to try to hit them with everything they had. So you had the Enterprise VF-6 and bombing six and scouting six and fighting six. The fighters would usually stay with the dive bombers. The torpedo planes would be down around 1,500 feet. The bombers would be around 15,000 feet. And the fighters circling or S formation above them. And then you had Yorktown. Now, Yorktown Air Group had been shot up pretty badly at Coral Sea, so they only had scouting 5. But they had fighting 3, bombing 3, and torpedo 3. And then the Hornet, the new Hornet, with bombing 8, scouting 8, fighting 8, and torpedo 8, the Devastator. This was going to be the last time the Devastator saw any combat. And it was well known that these planes were ill-suited, but it's all they had at that point. And these planes would head down. As soon as they had a good fix on the Japanese position, they would take off around 6:30 a.m. and head for the Japanese fleet and try to overwhelm them and do as much damage as possible. Now, it's concerning Air Wing 8. It was under the command of Air Wing Commander Stanhope Cotton Ring. He was a very ambitious naval officer. He was the one who wanted to make admiral by the time he was 30. He didn't suffer fools gladly. He did not take Burt argument. He was very much in command. He said, you do it my way. Not very flexible when it came to learning a new way of combat. So you've got Air Wing 8, under the command of Stan Ring. You've got Fighting 8, 10. Now this is not the whole fighter's force. They're sending 10 of the Wildcats to support the bombers and torpedo planes under Lieutenant Commander Sam Mitchell. Then you've got Bombing 8 under Walt Johnson. Then you've got Scouting 8 under Lieutenant Commander Walt Rodee, and then Torpedo 8 under John C. Waldron. We'll be talking about Waldron in a moment, but this was the entire force that was being sent off. 34 dive bombers, 15 torpedo planes, and 10 fighters. And they were going to be joining up with the Enterprise and Yorktown planes. So, Lieutenant Commander Sam Mitchell took off with Fighting 8, and they went up to 20,000 feet, and they started waiting. Now, they had the least fuel capacity. The second planes that went were the torpedo planes. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, he's one of the legends of Midway. He had Sioux blood in him, and he was something like 1/8 Indian. He was either Sioux or Cherokee. I'm pretty sure it was Sioux. And he was very popular with his men, with his pilots, with his support crew. They liked him. He really worked with them, and he gave them as much training as possible, knowing the odds they were against. And just before the takeoff, or it may have been the night before, when they knew that we're headed for the Japanese fleet, he gave this note. He had this printed up, and he gave it to all of his men to read, that how important this mission was. In a chilling prophecy, he said, even if we're all shot down, if there's only one man left, I want that man to go in and get a hit. Let me lead you, he said. It may be the Sioux in me, but I know who the Japanese are. He swore he could smell them. But he said, follow me. Don't worry about navigation, follow me. And every man do your best to go in and get a hit. So they took off from the Hornet, and they would be flying at 1,500 feet. These planes could do at best, with a torpedo, with a Mark 13 torpedo on, at best maybe 135, 150 knots. The dive bombers could do around 230, and the fighters were able to do a little bit more than that. So they were going to be very vulnerable. I'll be telling you a bit about what kind of precautions they took, but we're still following history's version of it. This is what history has told us. So all three air groups took off at roughly the same time, and they headed on a course of 239 to 240 degrees, about southwest. And the Japanese fleet was supposed to be 155, keep losing you. The Japanese fleet was 155 miles away. So if they all stayed together, they should roughly meet the Japs at the same time. And then they would supposedly try a coordinated attack with the torpedo planes coming in low from all directions, and the dive bombers coming in the top, and the Wildcats protecting them from the fighters. So this was the attack force of 151 planes that was going at the Japanese. Meanwhile, back at the Japanese fleet, Nagumo had a crucial decision when he found out that there was a carrier out there and that the Americans were, at any point, could be launching an attack. He didn't see, he only saw one carrier, which is probably the Yorktown. That was what his float plane saw, and they did not see the other ones, which were over the horizon. So he had to make a decision. The first strike force had landed. Now, should he launch the second strike force to go after Midway or after the U.S. carrier? Which was the greater threat? And he later described it as a hunter trying to decide which of two hares to attack, to shoot. And so he finally decided that the carrier was the greater threat. So he sent the first strike force down and loaded the second one up with aerial bombs, or ship bombs, the armor-piercing bombs, and torpedoes, and that they would head off to the last reported position of a U.S. carrier. Then they would hit that carrier, and then they would go back to finishing neutralizing Midway. So he turned to the northeast to aim for the new threat, to get in close and launch his attack and hit the American carriers. His ships were arranged in a square formation with the Akagi leading the Kaga on the starboard column and the Hiryu leading the Soryu on the port column. So, he had just the last plane had landed, and he had turned northeast to attack, to head toward the American ship. And that's when the first torpedo plane showed up. Torpedo 8 went in. Now, they were all alone. They had no fighter protection. And the Japanese Zeros, which had been flying air cover, went after them. And all the air gunners started aiming towards the water to shoot at them. And one by one, these torpedo planes were shot down. Waldron was seen that an explosion in his cockpit. He stood up in his cockpit, and suddenly the plane disappeared. They were all shot down, one by one. It was a shooting gallery. At last, all 15 of them had gotten down. Not one of them had managed to get close enough to launch a fish. Now, we have to consider the fact that at that time, the American pistol, the exploder mechanism on the Mark 13 and Mark 14 torpedoes were very faulty. Even if one of those torpedoes had reached a carrier, it probably wouldn't have exploded. So it was a futile and tragic effort. Then, torpedo 6 from the Enterprise showed up. And they were shot to pieces and lost 12 planes. A few of them managed to get away. And then, at last, torpedo 3 arrived. Now, why all 3 torpedo squadrons reached first is still a little fuzzy about that they were flying a more direct course, but they reached them first, and by one. And all these Zeros were diving on and attacking these torpedo planes and shooting them down. All the anti-aircraft gunners from the cruisers and destroyers and battleships and carriers were all pointed at the water and shooting at these planes and bringing them down. and 8 of Torpedo 3's planes were shot down. Nagumo must have been feeling pretty good by this time because he managed to beat off the B-17s, the B-26s, the TBFs, and the Marine dive bombers, and then 3 torpedo squadrons, all without a single one of his ships being hit. Now, Ensign George Gay, we know, was the lone survivor, and he had gone in and launched his torpedo, but to no effect. Don't know if it hit anything or if it even got close. But he managed to survive, and he stayed there under his Mae West and under his flotation cushion and watched the battle. Deservedly, it's a good thing he survived. He was able to tell his story, and it's become part of a legend. "24 airmen from Enterprise were shot down, 12 CVDs. The Hornet lost all 15 planes. "16 airmen from Yorktown and 29 men. 69 men were killed without a single hit. But they had done something pretty important. Even if they had not done any physical damage to the Japanese fleet, they had really screwed up Nagumo's plan because his ships had to maneuver so much to avoid all these attacks. They were well behind their timetable. They were still dealing with the idea of going after a carrier. The decks were covered with planes, with fuel, with bombs and torpedoes. They were floating powder kegs. So at this point, the Hiryu was far to the north, about 10 miles to the north, and the Soryu, Akagi, and Kaga were all bunched up to the south. And in order to launch their strike, they had to get back into formation and head into the wind. That was the key goal.
Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize. We experienced some technical difficulties during the recording of this video. Sound will be returned to this video shortly. Again, we apologize for the technical difficulties. Sound will be returned to the video shortly.
Been sick with the flu, and he came up on deck just before this happened, and he was up with Nagumo on the Akagi flag bridge, and he saw these ships being torn apart. He saw these planes and everything exploding right in front of him. And when the attack was over, he said, "Shimada, we goofed." He could not believe how everything had gone to hell in such a short time. Well, this was at the extreme range of the American air groups. Now, the carriers were still sort of heading to the southwest to try to meet their ships, their planes. But as they started heading back, they started running out of gas. Max Leslie had to ditch near the Cordeiro Astoria. And some of them made it back and landed on their carriers. Now, I'm going to wrap this up. We know what happened to Yorktown. Yorktown was hit with 2 attacks from Hiryu. First bombing attack and then a torpedo attack, which finally finished her off. The bombing planes that had made it back, and the fighters that made it back, and the few torpedo planes that made it back, had landed on Enterprise and Hornet, and some of them had landed on Yorktown. But they took off again and they got over to the Enterprise and Hornet when it looked like Yorktown was going to be hit. So, what happened to Air Wing 8? History says that some of them landed on Midway or were shot down by Midway gunners or ditched in the lagoon. All the fighters had to ditch. They never made it back to their carrier. All 10 of them ditched. 2 pilots were lost. And the dive bombers that made it to Midway, the other scouting 8 made it back to the Hornet, all still carrying their bombs. Why didn't they show up? Why didn't they, following the same course at the same time, heading for the same target, why didn't they show up? Where were they? Yorktown was finally badly damaged, and she was sunk by a Japanese submarine on June 7th. So we lost Yorktown. We managed to win a pretty big victory. But it wasn't any thanks to the Hornet. Hiryu, of course, was finally attacked by planes from Midway, from the Enterprise, from the Yorktown, and from the Hornet. Interestingly enough, that the Hornet Air Group, again, bombers led by Stan Ring, all dived on the Hiryu and not one of them managed to hit it. And when Ring landed back on the Hornet, he was screaming at his plane captain. He said, I kept pushing that damn button and it never dropped the bomb. What the hell is wrong with this thing? And the plane captain looked into the cockpit and he realized that Ring did not know that there was a bomb selector switch on the throttle quadrant that you had to switch first before you tried to drop the bomb. He didn't know this. The man who led these two strikes did not know how to drop the bomb. He also did not know that there was an emergency release toggle underneath the instrument panel. So he landed with a bomb still on his plane, and he was mad as hell. And the other pilots were looking like, what an idiot! This guy led us? So the Hiryu was also bombed again by the B-17, which again claimed the kill. But it was the dive bombers from the Enterprise and a few left over from the Yorktown, and the Marine dive bombers from Midway that finally finished it. So why did this happen? Well, we have to go to the man who was in command of Hornet on the bridge, Captain Mark Mister. Now, he has gone down in history in the Second World War as one of the architects of the fast carrier striking forces. One of the most effective means of using aircraft carriers. He was one of the earliest naval aviators, graduated from Annapolis in 1916. He flew the MC-3 in a flight across the Atlantic in 1924. And yet, it's an interesting thing. He graduated 2 points from the bottom of his class. But he was in command of Hornet, and he was an aviator, a naval aviator. So he thought he knew more about it than Spruance or Fletcher. So he handled things his own way. Going back a bit, when the 3 carriers had been hit, and all the planes started landing, Commander Ring had showed up, stormed into the island superstructure, and Mister said, well, I hear we've had a great victory. We sank a bunch of ships. You got the Jap carrier. How did you do? I would have loved to be a fly on the wall during that conversation. Because Ring had to admit we didn't find the Japanese. Why did this happen? How could they not find them? So, Captain Mister gave the order to his squadron commander when everybody got back to the ship, and he made the order to Ring and to Rhodey and to Johnson and to Mitchell. I will file the after-action report. It was standard practice for every squadron commander, or at least the surviving squadron commander, the senior surviving officer, would write the after-action report explaining what had happened in the course and everything like that. That was standard practice, but Mitchell said, no, I will write the after-action report. And he wrote in his report that would go to through once, and then to Nimitz, explaining that the Japanese fleet was 155 miles southeast of this position, course 23924, 0 and we launched the attack. When they failed to find the enemy, they flew to the south to try to intercept the enemy advance. And then he explained that he had lost all his fighters, all his torpedo planes, and all of his, most of his dive bombers made it back, except for the ones that were shot down at Midway. This report was a lie. It was a whitewash. It was a CYA. Charlie Yankee Alpha. Cover your ass. This was not the truth. But history recorded this as the truth. In all the books that were written about Midway, they followed this plan, that the Hornet planes flew along with Enterprise and Yorktown's plane. Why didn't they find the Japanese fleet? How could you miss it? They didn't find it. The key to the mystery came several years after the war. Major Bowen Weishaupt of the United States Marine Corps. He had gone to St. Joseph's Academy at Annapolis. And one of his classmates was C. Markland Kelly. They were close friends, and they stayed in touch. Weishaupt went off to the Marine, and he was a navigator in the Pacific. Kelly joined Fighting 8 on the Hornet for his first battle. Kelly was there at Midway, and he went off with Sam Mitchell Fighting 8. He didn't survive because when Fighting 8 tried to make it back to the carrier, they all had to ditch. All 10 ditched, but only 8 of them were picked up. 2 planes were lost, and one of them was Kelly's plane. Weishaupt had learned about his friend's death after the battle. He served throughout the war, and then he had learned that Kelly's father was setting up an educational fund in his son's name, the C. Markland Kelly Trust. So he joined as a trustee and started attending meetings. They were both from Baltimore, and they were started attending meetings. And one day in one meeting, sometime in the late 1980s, he had noticed on the wall okay, all right, I got this out of order, but he noticed on the wall a small frame with a $10 bill in it, and there was writing on that bill. You know what a short snorter is? Say aye if you do.
Aye.
Wow, I wasn't the only one who didn't know. A short snorter, if you have been shot down or you're in a life raft and you're floating around the Pacific waiting to be eaten by sharks, and then a PBY or a patrol boat comes by and picks you up, hopefully on your side. It is the tradition to give that captain or pilot the largest denomination bill you've got in your pocket, even if it's soggy. That's called a short snorter. So this bill was given to Ensign Jerry Crawford of BP 51, which had been sent out to start looking for downed aviators. And they found some of the pilots of Fighting 8. And they picked up this pilot. So when that PBY pilot learned about the educational trust, he donated the bill, even though he had not found Kelly, but he had donated the bill and it went to the trust, and that's why it was on the wall of the meeting room. And Weishaupt saw it. This is it. And he wrote down the information on it. It had latitude and longitude and information. The pilot had written down where he had picked up this airman from Fighting 8. So then Weishaupt went home with this information. He made photocopies of the bill. He went home with this information and looked on a Navy chart and started following. And he pinned down where the planes had been picked up. And then he looked at Morrison and Crange and Lord didn't line up. For some reason, these planes were picked up 50 miles north of where these had supposedly been, where history had said they were, 50 miles north. And then he started talking to other naval aviators and navigators. Now, he was a navigator, so he knew this stuff. And they were all doing the same thing. They were shaking their heads. This doesn't make any sense. And then he started interviewing surviving crew and pilots of Air Wing 8. And they told him what really happened. And it changed everything. What happened was that they did not fly the same course as Enterprise and Yorktown. Instead of flying 239, 240 degrees to the southwest, they flew almost straight west, much too far north. And the reason is, okay, I got a couple of slides out of order here, I'm sorry. This is back when he wrote that after action report. I think this is the next one. What did I do? Okay, I missed something. All right, I missed a slide somewhere, but I'll tell you what happened. Just before the launch, Commander Sam Mitchell of the fighters went up to the fly on the Hornet superstructure. And he went directly to Captain Mitchell. He said, "Sir, I'm really worried about the torpedo plane. They're completely defenseless. I'd like permission to stay with them instead of to stay with the dive bombers. I can protect them from there." And Mitchell said, "No. I don't believe that the torpedo planes will even reach. They won't even find the Japanese fleet. It's not worth it. I want you to stay with the bombers." And Mitchell again protested, "Sir, I strongly urge that you let me stay with the torpedo planes." At that point, Rhodey, Johnson, Ring, and Waldron showed up. And the same argument went on, and it went back to the same thing. No, you stay with the dive bombers. They have a better chance of fighting the Japanese fleet. Then Ring gave the announcement, "We will fly a course of 265 degrees, and we will find the Japanese fleet and attack them." He was probably hoping to hit them from the north when they came up that way. And Waldron, who was much more independent and didn't mind speaking up, said, "That's not going to work. That's not where they are. We know they're to the southwest. They're at 239, 240 degrees. Your course is more than 30 degrees north. We'll never find them." And he protested to Mister, and Mister said, "You will follow Commander Ring's orders." Now, there's no way to know who wrote the script, whether it was Mister or Ring, but they were backing each other up. Waldron wasn't happy about it, but he followed orders. So Mitchell took off, then Waldron took off, then Rhodey and Johnson and Ring all took off. And they took off on a course of 265 degrees. And as the other two strike forces were also launched, their courses diverged, or expanded, spread out. The Hornet was heading straight west, and the others were going to the southwest. About half an hour into the flight, Waldron broke radio silence. Now, they were down there at 1,500 feet, 15,000 feet for the bombers, 20,000 feet for the fighters. And the fighters have to fly S formation to stay with the slower bombers. And Waldron said, "This isn't going to work. I know where the Japs are. Follow me." And Ring, who was apoplectic over Waldron breaking radio silence, said, "You fly on me." Then there was silence. 10 minutes later, Waldron said, "To hell with you. Follow me, boy." And he veered off to the southwest. And the fighters and bombers looked down and they saw the torpedo planes heading off to the southwest. Ring continued to fly on his own. And of course we know what happened. Somehow Torpedo 8 found the Japanese first, by themselves, with no fighter protection, the fighter protection that Minter would not give them. And they kept flying west. While the attack was going on, while Enterprise and Yorktown planes were tearing the Japanese fleet apart, Ring continued to fly west. At last, Johnson, in bombing 8, realized that if he didn't turn around now, they weren't going to make it back to the ship. But he decided to fly south to see if they could intercept the Japanese fleet. But he headed south with his plane, his 17 planes. Didn't say anything to Ring. He just said, let's go this way, boys. And they flew south. They didn't find the Japanese fleet, but they did eventually reach Midway. They managed to either ditch or land or got shot down. Rhodey was still with Ring, and then finally he said, we've got to turn around or we're not going to make it back. So he turned around and headed off. And over his shoulder he saw Ring flying on by himself. Talk about anal. This guy was not going to change his mind, and he wasn't going to let anybody else do it. So Rhodey said, okay, if we conserve fuel, we can find point option and we can reach the ship. About halfway back, a lone SPD went by at top speed, passing him. It was Ring. He wanted to land first. You know what that means? Charlie Yankee Alpha. He landed by himself. By this time, the word of the three carriers being shot up and sunk or attacked and destroyed by Enterprise in Yorktown was already, everybody knew. And they wanted to see, how did we do? Ring landed his plane, climbed out, didn't say a word to his plane captain, and walked into the island superstructure. Then he went to talk to Minter. That's when Minter realized things had gone badly. And Minter then wrote his after-action report. He's lost 10 fighters, he's lost 15 torpedo planes, and he's lost a few of his dive bombers. Then when the next wave went off to attack the Hiryu, and they all missed except for Ring, who didn't know how to drop his bomb. And then the following day, they discovered there was a report of a Japanese cruiser or a battleship that was off to the northwest that was probably either picking up survivors or hoping to pick off some American ships. So they sent 30 dive bombers from the Hornet to attack this one ship. Not a single one hit the ship. The destroyer, it was a destroyer, and it just kept on twisting, and none of them hit. Well, when this all got back to Struan and then to Nimitz, Struan wanted Minter and Ring court-martialed. But Nimitz nixed it. He said, we just had a great victory. I'm not going to open a can of worms by introducing this. Let's just put it to sleep. And that's why history didn't know what really happened to Air Wing 8. Now the ultimate irony is right here. Admiral Stanhope Ring was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway. That was undeserved victory, or undeserved praise. It was a $10 bill that brought out the truth of Air Wing 8. Now you finally know the truth. If you want to read an excellent book about this, it is A Dawn Like Thunder by Robert Mrazek, a former congressman. Mrazek, M-R-A-Z-E-C-K. A Dawn Like Thunder, the true story of Torpedo Squadron 8. It tells the whole story, and this is where I found this story. So thank you all very, very much for hearing this, and I hope you liked it. Hope you appreciated it, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Mark. We appreciate it, folks. Let's give you just a second to hear about the books, though, Mark. Tell us about the book.
Thank you for mentioning that. I've been here a couple times before, and I have some books I did a talk about flying on film, a century of aviation in the movies, 1912 to 2012. And my last one was the Marine Launch Squadron, the Odyssey of VMS 422. It's another mystery of the Second World War about a Marine Corps squadron during the Marshall's campaign. But I also have two books that would make great Christmas gifts. Hint, hint. About my guide dog. I think I have both of them, but I may only have one of them. Saffron, my book, is Confessions of a Labradiva, Another Blonde Leading the Blind.